Welcome back, readers, to The Secret Lake. Today we're reading Chapter 15, Afternoon Tea. The following afternoon, Tom and Stella knocked on Mrs. Moon's patio garden door. Good morning, Tom and Stella. How nice to see you, dears. With the help of her walking stick, Mrs. Moon stepped out into her patio garden. It was strange how alert she could seem on some days compared with others. Their mother had told them she had an illness that made her forget things and people some of the time, but not others. They were glad to have caught her on a good day. "We called to see if Harry's back yet," said Stella politely. Tom nodded enthusiastically. Harry had gone missing earlier that day. "He's a one, isn't he?" exclaimed Mrs. Moon. "Went off this morning, but he'll be back by tonight, mark my words." She winked playfully. "He knows it's lamb, you see." Stella and Tom smiled. Mrs. Moon chuckled. "You know, the Williamsons next door are convinced he's got two homes. They're probably right." "Is Charlie working today?" Tom said suddenly. Mrs. Moon's gaze fell to the ground as she slowly picked her way across her patio towards the wrought iron chair in the shade of a small fig tree. "Do sit down, dear," she said, signaling with her stick towards the wooden bench. "My legs aren't as strong as they used to be. Now, where were we? Oh, yes, Charlie. No, dears, he's not here on Fridays. Have you lost something in the garden, dears?" "Oh, no," said Tom, reddening. "Where does Charlie live, Mrs. Moon?" asked Stella carefully. "Up towards Kilburn, dear, about 2 miles from here." She seemed to hesitate. "He's a bit sharp with you little ones sometimes, I know, but he means well enough. He lives for the garden." She took in a deep breath and looked out towards the trees. "Where does Charlie think Harry goes?" asked Stella, popping a blackcurrant polo into her mouth and following Mrs. Moon's gaze. Mrs. Moon smiled stiffly and shook her head, and now Stella regretted her remark, for the old lady's eyes were suddenly glistening. "Would you like some biscuits, dears?" Tom, ever hungry, nodded eagerly. With the help of her stick, Mrs. Moon raised herself from her seat again. "Can I help?" asked Stella, jumping up. "No, no, dear." The old lady tutted and shook her head, suddenly exasperated at her own frailty. "You wait here, dears. I'll be back presently." The children watched in silence as Mrs. Moon slowly walked back across the patio, leaning on her stick. She seemed to be muttering something to herself. For a good 5 minutes they sat politely waiting for the old lady to come back. In fact, they were just starting to think they'd been forgotten when she appeared in the doorway. "My, oh my, visitors! How nice to see you, dears." An awkward silence filled the air as Mrs. Moon stepped forward and fixed a vacant stare on the children. Stella froze inside. Mrs. Moon was looking at them most oddly. Suddenly Tom's tummy let out the most almighty rumble. Stella cleared her throat reprimandingly just as Mrs. Moon jerked out of her trance. "Dear me," said the old lady. "Did I just go in for something? I could have sworn—" "Biscuits," said Tom sternly. He was starving. Never mind bursting for a cold drink. Stella nudged him hard in the ribs, which made him yelp. "Would you like a biscuit, dear? Oh, yes, that would be nice. Have you just moved to the garden? I don't suppose you've seen my dog, have you? He's called Harry. He goes missing, you know, for days at a time sometimes." Tears were suddenly welling in the old lady's eyes. Stella stood up. "No, Mrs. Moon, we haven't seen Harry," she said gently. She took Mrs. Moon by the arm and helped her sit down. "But I'm sure he'll be back tonight. It's lamb for dinner, you know." "My, oh my, it is! Is it Friday today?" said Mrs. Moon. Stella nodded. "What a clever girl you are. Well, it was nice to meet you, dear. I always like to see new faces in the garden. I think I shall have to lie down now. I get so tired these days. Off you go and play now, and come again tomorrow, will you?" "I'll be less tired then. Goodbye then, dears." The old lady was still nodding and smiling as the children walked away. "Oh, well, that was a waste of time," said Stella as they passed out the gate. "She's so sweet," said Tom. "How could Charlie Green be so mean taking Harry from her?" "We don't know that he does, Tom," said Stella. "It was only an idea." Tom halted in his tracks and gave a deep frown. But as a dog's yelp echoed across the garden, the threads of his thoughts evaporated. "Look, here's Harry!" shrieked Stella. Harry was racing across the lawn towards them. As he shot in between them, droplets of cold water sprinkled their shins. "Harry!" yelled Tom. But Harry didn't stop. Mrs. Moon had been right about the lamb. It took Tom and Stella about 2 seconds to have the same thought. Immediately they raced towards the island and scrambled as fast as they could inside the rhododendron bush. But they were to be disappointed. The tunnel was nowhere to be found. The following morning Charlie Green telephoned to say Mrs. Moon had taken a bad turn and that he called a doctor and would their mother be able to sit with her for an hour later on. Alarm bells immediately set ringing in Tom's head. This was a ploy. Charlie must have found out they'd been asking about him and didn't want them talking to the old lady again. But why? Charlie Green's onto us, Stell. He said as soon as their mother had left the room. He's trying to keep us away so we don't tell Mrs. Moon about Harry and the time tunnel. I think we should go there right now. He might have even drugged her. Stella picked at her painted blue fingernails, deep in thought. Oh, I don't know, Tom. She is an old lady, and she is ill. You've seen how she gets. Later that day their mother returned from Mrs. Moon's to confirm that the old lady was in bed and resting and would have 24-hour nurse care for the next few days. Seems she hasn't been eating enough, and that's very important at her ripe old age. How old is she then? Said Tom. She told me she was 105 on the day we moved in, his mother replied with a chuckle. But I think that was on one of her confused days. Mind you, she can't be far off from 100, and that's nearly as old as these houses. Tom stared through his mother and tried hard to imagine living for 100 years, but the thought alone exhausted him. No wonder the old lady was in bed. It was a full week later before Mrs. Moon was finally well enough to receive visitors. Needless to say, Tom and Stella were both elated when she rang to invite them back. Join us next time for Chapter 16.